and the home of the brave.
That's true.
Hey, what's up, everyone? This is Ramiro with Anticonquista. Anticonquista is an anti-imperialist media collective. Our content is produced by and for the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora. And welcome to episode 11 of Decolonizing Media. Decolonizing Media is a video podcast dedicated to exposing capitalist and imperialist ideology in mainstream media, especially when we're talking about Latin America, the Caribbean, and socialism. So today we're talking about anti-government protests in Hong Kong and why I believe they serve the interests of Western imperialism. Before we start, I want to remind you all to support Anticonquista's work and become a patron on Patreon. Make sure to go to patreon.com/Anticonquista and sign up to donate to us monthly, even if it's just $1 a month. Most of the money that we collect is sent to revolutionary groups in Latin America and the Caribbean that are directly serving our people. Only a small portion of it is used to pay for our website and our podcast hosting fees. Me and the other co-editors of Anticonquista don't keep a single penny of that money. All of us put in work for Anticonquista on a volunteer basis. And this is something that we want to keep on doing. And so becoming a patron on Patreon is your way to support us so that we can continue doing this work for you. So that said, let's go back to what's going on in Hong Kong. The protests first broke out in March of this year in response to proposed amendments to Hong Kong's extradition law. Extradition is the arrest and delivery of a fugitive wanted for a crime committed in another location. The amendments to Hong Kong's extradition bill would let local authorities detain and extradite people who are wanted in territories that Hong Kong doesn't have extradition agreements with. That includes the People's Republic of China and Taiwan, which calls itself the Republic of China. The amendments were proposed after some piece of shit from Hong Kong strangled his pregnant girlfriend and stuffed her body in a suitcase while they were visiting Taiwan in 2018. The guy who murdered his girlfriend, Chan Tong Kai, fled back to Hong Kong. But because Hong Kong doesn't have an official extradition treaty with Taiwan, he couldn't be sent back to face trial. So in response, Hong Kong's chief executive, Carrie Lam, suggested that changes be made, which is common sense. The protests didn't really take off, though, until June 9th, when Lam prepped the proposed amendments to the extradition law for Hong Kong's legislature. That was when thousands of people were seen protesting in the streets. And on June 12th, the day the amendments were set to be reviewed for a second time in Hong Kong's legislature, the protests escalated even more. Protesters started fights and surrounded Hong Kong's legislature, delaying talks over proposed amendments to the extradition law. In response to the protesters, Hong Kong police fired tear gas, beanbags, and rubber bullets. 3 days later, Lam indefinitely suspended the proposed bill that would have amended the extradition law. At the time of this recording, the bill has only been suspended and not formally withdrawn. Still, the protests have continued. In fact, there was a huge one this past weekend where there were thousands of people in the street being violent against the police. On July 1st, the anniversary of the British handover of Hong Kong, which we'll go into in a bit, protesters stormed and vandalized the Legislative Council. On August 6th, a citywide strike shut down transportation in Hong Kong, making it impossible for people to get around. And from August 12th to 13th, protesters occupied Hong Kong's airport, blocking flights from landing and taking off. Tons of flights were canceled and a lot of people were left stranded. As far as I know now, the protests are still going on and the protesters are now making 5 demands. Number 1, get rid of the extradition bill. Number 2, retract the use of the word riot to classify the protests, since rioters can face up to 10 years in jail. Number 3, for police to release all protesters who have been arrested and drop all charges that have been brought against them. Number 4, for the government to convene an independent inquiry into alleged brutality by Hong Kong police. And lastly, number 5, the implementation of a Western-style voting system, which they call democratic. In general, mainstream media outlets have been branding these protests as a pro-democracy movement against Chinese authoritarianism in favor of freedom and human rights. I'm going to show you all a quick video published by The Voice of America just a few days ago about the protests in Hong Kong. I think this will help you understand what I'm talking about when I mention the mainstream media line about Hong Kong. It's called Hong Kong Protests Continue, Confrontational and Quiet.
A subway station protest, which led to a standoff Wednesday, brought together diverse members of the city's population.
I am joining with other Hong Kongers, people in Hong Kong. We are aligned in that we need to make changes. The majority of Hong Kong people, at least 60% of us, are democratic in our views.
This guy is your typical fucking white settler who moves somewhere and all of a sudden claims they're part of the local population. Like, dude, you're white. You're not Chinese. You're not from Hong Kong. Why the fuck are you saying we and us?
Thursday, students mobilized, some advocating a school boycott in September.
We hope that this is a better way of struggle to prevent the attack from the police and the gangsters. And we think that when the students go on strike, it will give more confidence to workers to go on strike also.
Finding sympathetic listeners afraid Hong Kong will lose its special status.
If people now do not connect together, the communists are coming. They are just trying to make one country work, two systems, no.
Wednesday, a small demonstration at the British consulate demanded that China release a British consular worker detained in the mainland. Another example, they say, of Beijing's overreach.
It is already a global and international issue, so I think that the UK government should voice out more about this.
So in case you didn't hear, the protester said the UK government should do more about the situation. I don't think it's a good idea to get the UK government involved in anything, especially in the global south. When the British were colonizing India, South Africa, the Americas, and East Asia, they claimed they were helping people out and building civilization, whatever the fuck that means. And when they forced millions of people there to take their drugs and steal their resources, they also claimed they were helping out. So this guy is just totally fucking clueless.
People leave messages on walls, known as Lennon walls, after musician John Lennon demanding safeguards for Hong Kong's way of life.
I don't think the government is going to do anything except to drag its feet. It is unfortunate that it hasn't met any of the demands, the 5 demands that have been written on the wall, the Lennon wall, throughout the territory in Hong Kong. So I don't think it's going to end soon.
There's no shortage of commitment.
The world is watching us, and we all know that freedom is needed, and we need to fight for freedom as well as the human rights.
Protesters say they'll keep working however they can to get out their message. Mike O'Sullivan, VOA News, Hong Kong.
So this is the kind of bullshit that we're being fed every day by mainstream media. We're being told that the only thing motivating these protesters are democracy and freedom. I think that's complete bullshit, and so do you probably. I don't doubt that these protesters have grievances with the way things are in Hong Kong. After all, Hong Kong isn't perfect, and neither is the People's Republic of China. But to think that a desire for democracy and freedom is the only thing motivating these protests is complete fucking nonsense. The bottom line is that the protests going on in Hong Kong right now directly serve the interests of Western imperialism. Imperialism, as I've mentioned in other podcasts, is the stage of capitalism that we're in now. It's the stage of capitalism where corporate monopolies and finance capital firms based on Wall Street run the global economy. Most of the time, they're in the business of weapons, gold, banking, and commodities trading. They're almost all tied to the military-industrial complex, a web of corporate and state actors who profit from war and invasion. These corporate monopolies and finance capital firms are then able to use state power in their first world countries to advance their economic agendas abroad. They're able to start wars with countries that don't open up their markets to Western capital, regardless of their ideology. You can take the case of U.S. destabilization attempts against the Shia Islamic government of Iran and the Catholic Socialist government of Venezuela. Even though they come from totally different backgrounds ideologically, they're both simultaneously being attacked because they're moving away from Western free market capitalism. By successfully leveraging state power against independent countries, these monopolists and finance capitalists are able to enforce their parasitic exploitation of the global South. They're able to exploit Asia, Africa, and Latin America for its land, labor, and resources. And unfortunately, that's been the case for the last few centuries, including in Hong Kong and China. If we want to understand how these protests in Hong Kong directly serve the interests of Western imperialism, we have to look at a few different things. We can look at the destructive history of British colonialism and US imperialism in China that's almost always left out of mainstream news coverage. We can take a look at Hong Kong's current geopolitical position and how Western control over the area benefits monopolists and finance capitalists in the imperial core. We can follow the money to see who's funding these protests and which corporations own the media outlets giving them positive coverage. We can look at similar examples of pro-democracy protests in other countries moving away from the West, so we know it's complete bullshit. And we can even take a look at the flags, slogans, and songs that they're using in protest. So we're going to get into all this and more in just a sec, but I just want to mention two quick things. First, I'm not going to go into detail about whether I think China is socialist or capitalist. I personally happen to think it's both. Anyway, that's another podcast for another day. But if you're a Marxist and you're familiar with the concept of contradiction, you'll understand how elements of socialism and capitalism exist simultaneously in a particular nation state. And if you're an anti-imperialist, you'll understand why it's our duty to oppose all imperialist destabilization plots, regardless of the victim country's views. I do want to mention that though I generally support the Chinese Communist Party, I do obviously have disagreements with some of their policies. Second, I want to remind everyone watching and listening to feel free and submit content to Anticonquista. We're always looking to publish anti-imperialist and communist content produced by and for the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora. Generally, we look for articles, videos, podcasts, books, and social media memes. So you can visit anticonquista.com/submissions to get a sense of the kind of content that we're looking for. And you can also hit us up at info@anticonquista.com for more information. So first, let's just go over the history of imperialism in China and Hong Kong. Hopefully this will give you some context as to why the Western imperialists should be the last ones talking about human rights and democracy in China. In 1820, China was estimated to have the largest economy in the world, according to British economist Angus Maddison. At the time, China was ruled by the Qing dynasty, which was the country's last imperial dynasty. In Europe, there was a huge demand for Chinese goods, especially silk, porcelain, and tea. But the British, who dominated global commerce for centuries, didn't take too kindly to that. Remember, just a few decades earlier, in 1776, they lost control over their fellow white settlers in what is now known today as the United States. After that, the British were determined to regain their status as the global hegemon. In doing so, they subjugated the Chinese people to about 100 years of brutal colonization, a period known to those in China today as the Century of Humiliation. So by the 1830s, the British East India Company started growing opium in modern-day India and Bangladesh, which were also colonized by the British. From there, the British smuggled tons of opium into China illegally, getting millions of people addicted to their drugs. The mass influx of drugs reversed China's economic growth, and entirely drained the country's resources. The British walked away with all of China's valuable resources, while the Chinese were being forcibly subjected to their drugs. In 1839, the Daoguang Emperor of the Qing dynasty rejected demands by the British to legalize and sell more opium in China. After the British refused to listen to the Chinese, the Daoguang Emperor confiscated all drugs being imported and ordered a blockade of foreign ships. About 2.66 million pounds were confiscated, according to Indian historian Amar Farooqi. The British, of course, responded by sending their major Royal Navy gunboats to China, shooting and bombing the shit out of its major ports and killing thousands of people. This became known as the First Opium War, which ended in 1842 with the Treaty of Nanking. The so-called treaty was more like a slap in the face to the Chinese people. Not only were the Chinese forced to continue being drugged by these white devils, they were also being forced to open up 5 of their ports to British merchants, ceding Hong Kong to the British Empire. This allowed the British to control a key trade route while making sure the Chinese remained dependent and weak. Still not satisfied, the British colonizers started the Second Opium War in 1856, receiving help from France and the United States. France and the United States, of course, also wanted a piece of the pie. The 3 Western powers resoundingly defeated the Qing dynasty once again, gaining almost full control of China. After the end of the Second Opium War, China's share of global gross domestic product, or GDP, fell by half, according to the World Economic Forum. Not only was China's economy totally fucked, but most of its people were poor, drugged, and uneducated, and dependent on Western capitalism, just the way they wanted it. It wasn't until 1949 that things started changing, when Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party established the People's Republic of China. After defeating the right-wing nationalists from the Kuomintang Party and successfully defeating Japanese imperialist invasion, China was finally able to stand on its own 2 feet. Drugs like opium were banned, workers and peasants won state power, women were liberated from being feudal servants and imperial concubines. China's socialist revolution brought dignity and power back to the Chinese people. Hong Kong, unfortunately, remained under the control of the British until 1997. That was when the British finally agreed to transfer their port colony back to China. Under the agreement known as One Country, Two Systems, Hong Kong is recognized as being part of China. But as a caveat, Hong Kong was forced to maintain its British economic, political, and legal models, different from socialism with Chinese characteristics. China refers to Hong Kong and Macau, another colonized port city, as a special administrative region. Special administrative regions have constitutions that are different from that of the People's Republic of China. Now let's get into Hong Kong's geopolitical importance. And my apologies in advance for mispronouncing some of the Chinese names I'm about to say. So the region known as Hong Kong includes Hong Kong Island and the Kowloon Peninsula. Both are separated by Victoria Harbor, one of the busiest waterways in the world. You can take a wild guess at who named it Victoria Harbor. Hong Kong sits at a very important geographic position. It has direct access to the South China Sea, where 1/3 of global commerce passes. It's also where the US is now instigating territorial disputes with Vietnam and the Philippines. Hong Kong also sits at the mouth of the Chukiang River, which is known as the Pearl River in English and was previously called the Canton River. It's one of China's most important rivers since it splits off into a bunch of other rivers that lead to major cities like Guangzhou and Zhaoqing. These cities are part of mainland China and are home to major centers of industry. So theoretically, a foreign-controlled Hong Kong could entirely block the Chukiang River, cutting a bunch of cities off in the mainland from maritime trade. Hong Kong is also just over 400 miles away from Taiwan. Although Taiwan has historically been Chinese for thousands of years and is officially part of the People's Republic of China, it's not administered by Beijing. Instead, the government of Taiwan calls itself the Republic of China. That's because Taiwan is where the right-wing nationalist Kuomintang Party fled to after Mao and the communists kicked their asses during the Civil War in the 20th century. Taiwan is also desired by Western imperialists because it's just 110 miles away from the Chinese coastline. So essentially, control over Hong Kong and Taiwan would allow foreign invaders to blockade large parts of mainland China and economically destroy the country. First world powers have a vested interest in using both rebel provinces of China as bases of opposition to Beijing. Former CIA collaborator and US diplomat Sid Goldsmith even admitted Hong Kong's geopolitical importance during a 2017 speech at the Foreign Correspondents Club in Hong Kong. He described Hong Kong as a, quote, listening post for the United States and Western forces. That's why President Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party have emphasized the Belt and Road Initiative, also referred to as the New Silk Road. The New Silk Road is a trade and development route that expands westward into Central Asia. It makes China less economically dependent on its eastern coast for importing and exporting goods. It's also connected to what's going on in Kashmir right now with the US-backed repression being carried out by the Indian government. Kashmir sits right at the heart of the New Silk Road, which Pakistan and China have been cooperating on. But India, taking orders from the United States, is now determined to cut the area off and create another choke point for Chinese trade. There's also a long history of religious and tribal conflict in Kashmir that's involved, but that's also another topic for another podcast. But I wanted to point that out, though, because it's all connected. Western destabilization attempts in Hong Kong are connected to massacres in Kashmir, which are also connected to the ongoing US-China trade war. For years now, Donald Trump has been ratcheting up economic tensions with China. Earlier this month, he said he would raise existing tariffs on $250 billion worth in Chinese products to 30% from 25% on October 1st. He also announced that tariffs on another $300 billion worth of Chinese goods, which start to take effect on September 1st, will now be 15% instead of 10%. China, of course, has retaliated with its own tariffs, despite wanting to de-escalate tensions. But all of this forms part of the coming US war against China and its attempt to destabilize its growth. It's also a way for the US and the UK to weaken the new global axis of resistance against Western imperialism, which includes China, Russia, Iran, Syria, Venezuela, Cuba, Bolivia, Nicaragua, Zimbabwe, and possibly Pakistan. Even though all of these countries are run by governments with totally different ideologies, they're all united in their material resistance to Wall Street and London. Unfortunately, that's what a lot of anarchists and first worldist communists fail to understand. They're using the outdated Cold War logic of socialism versus capitalism to figure out who they defend in the 21st century multipolar world. Like me personally, I'm a third worldist communist and an atheist, but I support all of those countries in their fight against Western imperialism. That's because as communists, we're supposed to adapt our analysis to current material reality, not the other way around. As Marxist materialists, we have to understand that the material is primary and the ideal is secondary. Next up, let's talk about who's funding the current protests in Hong Kong and the role of corporate media. I highly recommend you check out Alex Rubinstein's article in Mint Press News called American Government NGOs Fuel and Fund Hong Kong Anti-Extradition Protests. He does a great job at cataloging the shit ton of money that's being poured into these protests by the Western imperialists. His article makes reference to the central role of the U.S. National Endowment for Democracy, known as the NED, or as I call it, the National Endowment for Destruction. The NED was founded in 1983 under Ronald Reagan's administration with the self-declared purpose of, quote, promoting democracy abroad. In essence, they give money to pro-imperialist causes around the world that carry out the interests of Wall Street and London. The NED is known for perfecting this, quote, pro-democracy protest imperialist model that makes anti-imperialist governments seem like right-wing dictatorships and pro-imperialist protesters seem like left-wing freedom fighters. Interestingly enough, Karl Gershman, the NED's first and only president, was executive director of the Social Democrats USA and an officer of the Young People's Socialist League. Both of these groups were social imperialist and Trotskyist formations in the US that collaborated with the CIA in taking down genuine Marxist-Leninist movements around the world. Social imperialists like Gershman and Irving Kristol, another Trotskyist who turned neoconservative, were connected to the Congress for Cultural Freedom. The Congress for Cultural Freedom was a US government-connected group of Trotskyists and Social Democrats who supported anti-communist causes in the Soviet Union. They're the ideological ancestors of Jacobin, Haymarket Books, and the Democratic Socialists of America, which all support imperialist policies today. Anyway, back to the NED. So the NED currently has 4 main branches, at least 2 of which are active in Hong Kong: the Solidarity Center and the National Democratic Institute. The National Democratic Institute has been active in Hong Kong since 1997, when the British finally loosened their grip over it. In 2018, the NED gave $155,000 to the Solidarity Center and $200,000 to the National Democratic Institute for work in Hong Kong, and $90,000 to the Hong Kong Human Rights Monitor. And between 1995 and 2013, the NED gave Hong Kong Human Rights Monitor more than $1.9 million. That's a lot of fucking money. The US-funded National Democratic Institute has also worked closely with Hong Kong Journalists Association, the Hong Kong Labour Party, the Civic Party, and the Democratic Party of Hong Kong. All of these US and NGO-funded organizations are involved in the planning and mobilization of the protests we see going on now. And their members are the ones that are almost always featured in mainstream media speaking out against the so-called Chinese dictatorship. For example, you have the case of billionaire Jimmy Lai, one of the wealthy protest organizers in Hong Kong, who is also one of the top leaders of Hong Kong's Democratic Party. In July, Jimmy met with U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and Vice President Mike Pence in Washington, D.C. By the way, for those of you listening to this as a podcast, in this picture we're seeing of Jimmy and John Bolton, they both look fucking constipated. You can probably guess what they were talking about. And to add another layer, the mainstream media outlets reporting on these protests in favor of the protesters are owned by major networks like CBS, Sony, Comcast, Viacom, NBC, and Disney. Almost all of these networks are owned by major US and UK military-industrial complex corporations like Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and General Electric, which want to start a war with China and make money. So now you see how all of this shit is connected. How NGOs in Hong Kong are getting banked from the US and the UK and are paying people to participate in these huge protests, which are owned by the same multinational weapons corporations that own the same corporate media outlets celebrating these protests. The interconnections are insane. Lastly, you have the total censorship and media blackout of pro-China opinions. For example, Google recently disabled 210 YouTube accounts that express pro-China, anti-protest views, claiming it was an attempt by China to, quote, interfere in Hong Kong affairs. The fucking irony is ridiculous. Also, you have almost no mention in mainstream media of the millions of people who have attended rival pro-China and anti-imperialist protests in Hong Kong. Clearly, the Western-backed NGOs and corporate media outlets are helping to orchestrate this imperialist plot. And we can't forget to mention similar examples of, quote, pro-democracy regime change efforts in other countries and how they've ended up. Take a look at Libya. You have the 2011 coup, NATO-backed coup against Muammar Gaddafi, who led the revolutionary anti-imperialist Jamahiriya, which wanted to unite Africa, create a single African currency. He proposed a lot of progressive things in Libya, and he was quickly overthrown by these, quote, pro-democracy protests that form part of the Arab Spring. And now, today, Black Libyans are literally being sold as slaves in the black market in Libya, and also women are enslaved by these radical Wahhabis who are backed by Saudi Arabia and other radical Islamist groups. So Libya today is a complete mess because of these pro-democracy, quote, pro-democracy protests. You also have the case of Ukraine in 2014 when the president who was aligned with Russia and China was removed in Western-backed coup, Euromaidan, and you had these protesters who looked like hipsters and progressive and da-da-da. But at the end of the day, they ended up being Nazis, fascists, who killed everyone who was Russian and who kept and continue to this day attacking eastern Ukraine like Donetsk and Lugansk. People who are associated with Russia in any way, those people are being killed by the Ukrainian Nazis. And these are the people who claim to be progressive and pro-democracy when they were protesting in 2014. You have Syria. Luckily, President Bashar al-Assad and the Ba'ath Arab Socialist Party has been able to deter these terrorists and reactionaries from taking over Syria. But for a while there was a real fear that these so-called pro-democracy protests in Syria would take over and create another Libya. But luckily, they haven't been so far. And obviously, Venezuela and Nicaragua, since 2014 and especially in 2017 for Venezuela and Nicaragua, 2018 for Nicaragua, 2017 for Venezuela, you had these, quote, pro-democracy protests going on in both of those countries that were literally lynching and burning black and brown people in the streets who were associated with the Chavistas or the Sandinistas. So overall, if we look back at history and even just recent history, the last few years, you can see that this model of color revolution, pro-democracy style regime change always ends up really bad for the country where it takes place. Last but not least, their fucking flags and their protest signs. They say it all. The protesters in Hong Kong have been spotted waving US and UK flags and colonial era flags that go back to the Boxer Rebellion and the Opium Wars. They've also been recorded singing the US anthem, and one protester even had a sign that said, "President Trump, please liberate Hong Kong." I think actually a few people had those signs. And it just can't get any more obvious than that. Like, their signs and their flags literally are of their imperial masters. And that's what they want for Hong Kong. They want a colonized, westernized Hong Kong to be used as a platform of opposition to the People's Republic of China. So that's all for today. Thanks for listening and watching. This was episode 11 of Decolonizing Media. Decolonizing Media is a video podcast dedicated to exposing capitalist and imperialist ideology in mainstream media, especially when we're talking about Latin America, the Caribbean, the Global South, and socialism. Anticonquista is an anti-imperialist media collective that produces content by and for the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Anticonquista. Subscribe to us on YouTube, youtube.com/Anticonquista. Listen to our podcasts on SoundCloud, iTunes, Spotify, and Google Play. Just type in Anticonquista, it should come up. Help us financially and become a patron by going to patreon.com/Anticonquista. Sign up to send money to us on a monthly basis, even if it's just $1. As I mentioned earlier on, most of our money goes to revolutionary groups in Latin America and the Caribbean that we're building really close alliances with that are carrying out real political revolutionary work back in our motherland. And if you want to submit content to us, hit us up at info@anticonquista.com. You can also check out anticonquista.com/submissions for information on what we're looking for, articles, videos, podcasts, books, etc. Thanks again, and have a great week.